Hi everyone, it's Lee. I'm doing my first Relics. I call it a video, but it's more of a kind of podcast, I suppose, with some pictures. Having a chat about Britanans specifically, um, but with a bit of a twist. I'm gonna, instead of giving you a general overview of units right the way through the Britannian book, I'm going to look specifically at a force that I'm going to be taking to an event on the 11th of October in Worcester. Run through why I've chosen what I've chosen, why it's made the list, and hopefully give you an idea of building a certain list for a certain event based on a set of rules, as opposed to a kind of more general run through where you're actually getting, wow, this unit is good because of this and that and whatever. But with regards to when you're trying to build an army, what you actually want to do is look at how those units specifically synergize within a single list, and then you can tweak it over a period of time ready for an event. So I mean, I think I'm at a stage now where I'm ready to have a good run through of what I'm going to be taking on the 11th of October. Um, some people will and won't agree with my choices, and there may well be better choices to take, but for the way that I play and the type of lists that I like to run, I think that what you can see in front of you now is going to be a pretty effective list across quite a few of the Relics scenarios. Now, this particular event has a bit of a twist in that most Relics events have a standard set points value, so 300, 400 points are usually the typical value. This particular event starts off at 300 points. You then have to have a flanking reinforcement section of 100 points that enters the game, enters the second game on turn 2 and joins in with your main force. And then those two parts will combine together to form one 400 point list for the final game. So in terms of choices, I've had to also consider that particular element, that the extra 100 points that I'm adding in sorry about that, is going to have to actually enter the battlefield by itself and be kind of autonomous for a number of rounds until it can hit command range of the rest of my force. So yeah, there's a bit of a tweak and a change on the standard event, which is always good and interesting, and I think it helps keep the players on their toes, which is good. Just to give you a bit of a background, I run quite a few Relics events. We've got a local community here that there's about 10, 12 of us, and then with other people entering, we normally get up to about 16 players come in to play Relics. So I've seen quite a few lists in pretty much all the factions, with the exception of the Right End, however you want to call it. And that's only because they're so new. I haven't actually seen them on the battlefield an awful lot. And with some of the units not being ready for general use, I think they're just starting to get there in terms of their rules. It's going to be interesting to see how the Britanans play against them, if I'm lucky enough to be drawn against a player, and see how they do against them. So I'll perhaps feedback with another video after the event to tell you how badly I did, or hopefully how well I did. And yeah, and then you can have a look at then the first video, and I'll follow it up with who I played and how the games progressed and went on. So almost like mini battle reports, I suppose. So yeah, without further ado, I'm going to start cracking on, moving through the list as is written, and talking to you about those units, and then relating how those individual units and commanders will hopefully work for me on the event day. I generally like to play with quite large forces, of usually quite average models, as opposed to play very elite forces, and I think that's probably going to be reflected in my list. And yeah, so I'm going to start at the very top, so with the commanders, work my way through, and hopefully you guys are going to come back to me and tell me how rubbish it was, and how much better your lists are when you come and play at events. So starting at the top, I mean, there's obviously the commanders, and realistically at the moment there's three choices. One is the puppeteer, who I haven't decided to take on this occasion, and then the other two, which are in my list, are the Royal Arcanum Guard, who I think is fantastic for this type of list that I'm running, and also a company sergeant, who again you know, based on what I've taken through the rest of my force, I think really good. So I'm going to start off with the Royal Arcanum Guard and try and relate it into why he's so good based on the list that I've taken. So yeah, the Royal Arcanum Guard's got quite a few nifty abilities actually. He's got a pretty good stat line for a commander. Off the top of my head, command value is 8, and most importantly, he's got a good defense value of 2, which means he's actually quite hard to bring down, which is good because normally I play him quite aggressively, so quite far up the field, and there's a number of reasons for that, and when I get to the spells I'll talk to you about that. He's a 2/7 magic caster, so he can take 2 spells and he gets 7 dice, which again is pretty good. But most importantly, his inbuilt spells, the spells that he gets as a Britannan caster, are, well, they're bloody fantastic, to be brutally honest. Especially when you're taking 2 very large blocks of infantry, which I'm taking of troopers, simply because it keeps them in the way for that extra turn. So the way that a number of his spells all fit together are they're all in and around bringing death and fire and you know, causing your general run-of-the-mill troopers to be better at what they do. So going through the spells from the very top, he's got well, the 2 spells that I'm taking him for anyway, so I'll concentrate on those 2. Are Reinforced Stitching, which is absolutely amazing on the big units of troopers that I'm taking. And what that basically means is that once you've cast it onto a very large unit of 10 troopers, casualties from that unit don't get taken off as they occur, but they actually happen at the end of the turn. Now you might think, why is that any good? You know, they're dead, they're going to die anyway at the end of the turn. But with the way that you run a large list like the one that I'm running, is that you want to get up in your opponent's face. So the traditional kind of gun line that you see with Britanans isn't going to work with what I'm taking. You want to get up there as fast as possible and try and take as much high ground on the board as possible, by basically being a pain in the ass and getting in the way. So I'm going to be advancing quite heavily and quite quickly with my 20 troopers, casting this spell on them, so that even though my opponent is, you know, killing 5 or 6 perhaps come turn 3 when they're up there, actually they don't get taken off, so they're still in effect until turn 4. So it basically buys you a turn of your frontline 10-man screen, blocking line of sight to pretty much the rest of your army. Now I know there are some ways around this, but it's a pretty decent approach to holding a high line on the battlefield, and for him to be able to cast that spell on them just makes the troopers even better. And you'll find this with a lot of the Britannan units. They synergize quite well, so the commanders usually buff and force multiply the abilities of your really quite average infantry, to make them really, you know, really sing and really do a job for you on the day, basically. So that's the first spell, and that's, you know, that's going to be one of the main spells that he performs. The other spell that he has, which is also absolutely amazing, is King's Anger. Now that one is, again, it's a bit of a monster, simply because if you're in position and it goes off at the right place, yeah, it might set your units on fire, but with my list where I've got so many models, I don't really care about that. He can potentially hit quite a large amount of your opponent's army and cause quite a bit of damage. Now the other side effect of King's Anger is that it doesn't necessarily just target your opponent. Although the initial target has to be one of your opponent's units, the ensuing large blast that is inevitably going to come when you chuck 7 dice at this, because the size of the spell increases by 3 inches per successful casting, there's a pretty high chance that you can manipulate that spell so that if you need to, or if you want to, if it's beneficial for yourself, you end up catching your bombers, which I'm going to get to a bit later. Just keep in mind that this spell is really good for triggering them to explode, basically. Otherwise you have to take a bit of a risk with them. So again, those 2 things, working with the bombers and the troopers, mean that the Royal Arcanum Guard, in my opinion, is going to take preference over the puppeteer, basically, in my list as my main general for the entire game. So Hopefully it works. Hopefully I can put him in positions where I can, both cause damage and make my troopers really quite hard for my opponent. Now, the second commander choice, and I've actually taken two of these. One in the reserve column, and that's quite important, and one of them in my main 300 point list is the company sergeant major. He's basically cheap, and he has a pretty large command area, so that he can act as a backup to my Royal Arcanum Guard, especially when I'm being quite aggressive with him, just to make sure I can keep my troops in order. There are some other benefits to him when you do get up close and messy, and you've got 20 troopers. You can start buffing them with your horrible lot. You can make them do things, make them better in combat, make them better at shooting, although I don't really rate the troopers for shooting because they're unreliable. But having said that, if my opponent's got some low defense models, and they're ripe for a shot, and I'm not going on the double, then all the better for it. Drop one on and start shooting. He's just pretty reliable, for the 24 points or whatever he is. He gets behind there. He helps your units move forward with a large command area. And between the two models, I should be able to cover the majority of my army to make sure that nothing is ever out of command. Now, with Relics, I always play that you probably want to take two models that can command your army, just so that you aren't getting to a position where someone quickly does something, and lucky or not, they blow up your only character, and you're left a bit scuppered. But trying to kill both the Royal Arcanum Guard and the company sergeant major that start on the board is, from the games that I've played so far, and also the games that I've seen with other people playing, it's actually pretty hard to do, especially if you place them properly and you keep them well protected behind, in my list, two pretty large screens, and backed up with a bit of clever sniping and the bombers, basically. So I mean, that's what I'm gonna stick with for the commanding models, the commanders for my force to start with. I'm going to refer back to them quite a lot because of the way that the force overall is going to synergize. So yeah, moving on next, so past the two commander models, I've got to start with probably what I consider are going to be the stars of the show, really, and I think it's going to put a few people off their game, hopefully. And that is, I'm taking two very large blocks of troopers. It's one of a few units actually that can be taken above the normal size of 6 models. You can take up to 9 in a unit, and I've decided to take 2 units of 8, and to make them even bigger and even better, I've decided to add in the colour party into both units. Now I'm going to explain how that works. They're kind of one choice, really, because they end up merging together into a unit and you gain benefits from them, basically. So 2 big blocks of 10 models, as I've mentioned before, synergizing really well with both the company sergeant major and also the Royal Arcanum Guard, are going to mean that they're pretty hard to budge, simply from a volume of models perspective. And also, believe it or not, if you take the right spells on the Royal Arcanum Guard, Guided Arm's a good one, with the fact that you've got your company sergeant major, actually 10 models in Relics, regardless of how naff they start off, if they end up charging or getting stuck in, and you start adding some +1 dices into what they do, and then you add in gang up attacks, which with 10 models is, it's pretty good. You can throw out 3 or 4 pretty high-end attacks that surprise a few people when they start mashing through the larger models that your opponent might be throwing at you. The other advantage to having so many models in a single unit is that in terms of setting out a line with Relics, you can't see 3 units to target things behind. 10 models give you a massive screen, and like I said, for a whole turn, just on that magical turn when your opponent would normally wipe them off the board, thanks to reinforced stitching, they stay there till the end of the turn. So it's going to really hopefully bugger up at least 2 turns of my opponent's force trying to get anywhere, as these 2 ginormous blocks of infantry get stuck in and block line to everything behind them, basically. So yeah, I mean, you can grab the rulebook free from Tor Gaming's website, and you can have a look at the stats for the troopers. You'll see they're not very impressive to start with. But yeah, one of the things I will say that I've found so far is that if you're playing in the kind of style that I play with, the kind of list I'm playing with, actually shooting is secondary to putting on the bayonets and giving your opponent a good a good stuffing with the bayonet. So yeah, realistically, don't just consider them to be a shooting unit. You know, when you consider actually that when you take it unreliable into account, you can never tell when your gang up attacks are going to actually work or not. It's one of those where actually sometimes getting stuck in as opposed to carrying at on the back line of the board, shooting your 12 inches, probably, you know, it's one of those you weigh up depending on your list and how you construct it is another option for them. So I'm going to try in this event to ram them forward as far and as fast as I can and see where you go. So I mentioned the colour party that get added into that unit of 10. What they basically do, and that the whole reason why you take them in a list like I'm doing, is it increases their mobility, not by making them faster or by doing anything that would improve the actual speed of the models, but what it actually lets you do is prevent that unit from suffering the exhausted effect when you're going on a double, which again just means that there is no point in the game with that particular unit where I'm going to be, you know, worrying that, you know, if they are going on the double, they're going to be exhausted. Will they, you know, remove it? How is it going to affect them next turn? I don't have to worry about that. They're going to be fully functioning through the whole game, regardless of what I choose to do and where I need to relocate that unit to, basically. So that big unit, if you've never tried one before, give it a whirl. And if you're feeling flush and you want to go out and buy the models, the second unit is also it's also an interesting take, because your opponent then has to deal with the fact that not only they've gone through the one unit, they've got to then get through the other before they actually get to anything really substantial. And the other real benefit to them is that the actual point cost of that unit is so tiny compared to the amount of models that you get, that actually it enables you to take stuff that you wouldn't normally fit into a 300 point list, namely 2 bombers, because they're basically throwaway units, but with it in mind of you know, how many models I'm going to have and how many models my opponent's got to get through, taking 2 bombers, which will be my next option that I run through, is going to be an interesting one. And I think it's going to ask a lot of questions of quite a few forces that I come up against on that day. So moving on to the bomber is absolutely amazing since it's been errated. It's fast, it starts further up the battlefield, it can gain position, and then when you want it to go off, if it goes off in the way that you want it to, it does huge amounts of damage dice, and it ignores the things that typically would negate something that powerful being very good. So it ignores defense and all the other benefits to being in cover and everything else. This just ignores it. It explodes within a certain radius, 4 inches, it's 6 dice worth of damage, which is absolutely obscene. And then for another 2 inches, it's slightly less, but nonetheless, it's worth catching some models in there. Now, with the bomber, you have to be really careful that number one, it doesn't go off in and amongst your force, which isn't going to be a problem with my faction because they're going to be faster than the majority of my models. And number two, they're not just about the explosion. And this is really important to say when you consider the way the game of Relics is played, with the alternating units going backwards and forwards. What you use those bombers for isn't just to run them into a position, explode them and kill loads of models. Don't get me wrong, that's not a bad thing, but they also act as a really good deterrent for your opponent, especially the characters for your opponent, in terms of where you place them on the battlefield and where your opponent moves to in their turns, basically. So use them as a way of preventing and shutting down what the models in your opponent's army can do for a turn. Because I guarantee if you run one of these guys, let alone two, into a position where it's going to catch a lot of models, your opponent will have to maneuver away from the bomber before he tries to shoot it. And that, for 24 points, even if it gives you an extra turn, is worth its weight in gold. Now, the reason I'm taking two is because of, well, there's a couple of reasons actually. Number one, because I'm taking a Royal Arcanum Guard. I'm going to try and make a ginormous explosion that I just think will be funny on the battlefield. And number two, two of them can really prevent at least a turn of your opponent's initial moves in the game. And you know, if any of you are war gamers in any other system, you'll know how important movement is in pretty much every war game. So with Relics, there's no exception there. If you can get them into position, they basically set up this kind of bubble area that your opponent wants to get away from before they destroy it. Now, the real key is to try and catch some of your opponent's characters. Now, you might not kill your opponent's character with a bomber. If you do, then sweet, you've got lucky and it's gone off, and you've rolled your 6 dice, you've got a couple of doubles, and bye bye to your opponent's characters, which in Relics really hamstrings the rest of the game. If you can get a wound onto both of the characters that your opponent has taken, it really then limits how risky they can be with those 2 characters for the rest of the game, especially when you start talking about Marksman, which I'm going to get onto next, and also, to be brutally honest, the 20 troopers with their rifles. You've got to be really careful that you don't leave one hanging out in the open, because regardless of how rubbish the Britannian troopers are at shooting, if you manage to get a bead on a model and you throw enough dice at something, you're going to roll a double eventually. So yeah, the bomber itself is absolutely fantastic. If anyone has got a Relics Britannian force and hasn't yet bought themselves a bomber, check out the rules on the errata, on the tour game and download section, and then go and buy one pretty quick, because I can rarely see a reason why you would take 0 bombers in a list. I can't think of any particular build that I would take, unless you were going for some sort of theme force around something very specific, where you wouldn't get at least a turn's worth of value out of that 24-point bomber, even if he doesn't kill a single one of your opponent's models, and that for me makes it worth me investing in 2 of these guys for my particular 300-point list. Now, I know that some of the people on the tour site, when I put up the list, were saying, "Oh no, not 2 bombers," but I've not seen anyone take 2 bombers. I want to take them. I just think it's going to be quite funny, and if it goes off and my opponent starts moaning about it, it's one of those, isn't it? I'm playing at an event. I'm going to try and win the event, so throw them in there and see how it goes. So then, just to recap, I've been through the commanding models. I've been through the 2 massive units of troopers and what they're going to do. I've been through the colour parties that join in with the troopers and the bombers. One of the other real star choices for a Britannian force, and I've got one in the 300-point list, and I'll go on to the 100-point list afterwards, is a Marksman. Now these little blighters are absolutely brilliant for a number of reasons. They basically enable you to run a lot of the scenarios very quickly, because they can be placed pretty much anywhere on the board. There are some exceptions, but they can pretty much go where they like to start the game, which gives you great advantage in terms of picking up objects and being able to scarper. They also have an absolutely fantastic shot. So I generally only take them in units of 1, not units of 2, simply because I just don't see the point in taking a unit of 2 of them. They become quite expensive, whereas 1 Marksman rolling 4 dice and giving you a re-roll if you're unsuccessful, and can move, or depending on which way you want to go, you can move the value of 1 dice up or down 1, means that as far as giving you a guaranteed shot against something in the game of Relics, these guys are about as close as it gets, really. They're absolutely great for picking off specific models, anything that sticks their head out that shouldn't be, that should be screened. They can take a shot at it and have a pretty good chance of causing a wound. So I've got one of those in my 300-point list. Again, I'm not gonna ramble on about how you would necessarily use them move by move in the game, but generally you want to give them a position in the board. Now remember that your opponent in theory can do a double move in Relics, because if they finish the game as the last person to move and they then start the following turn by winning the roll to go first, a unit in a theory can double jump, or a model can double jump, and I think that catches some people out with the Marksman, because they push them too far forwards. Now you've got to remember that a Marksman's got a gun that shoots 18 inches and you're playing on a 3-foot board, so I suppose the only thing that you've got to be a little bit careful with is your initial placement of them. Don't worry about getting on the other side of the board. You can quite happily sit in between your deployment and the halfway if there's not objectives that you need to get with him, and just shoot people basically. It's one of those. I've seen it a few times where someone's pushed their 1 or 2 marksmen in quite a lot of the cases, way too far up just because their rules allow them, and then their opponent as a unit, and there you go, right, I move him, I'm going to move him again, and now the marksman is engaged, and you've just lost a relatively expensive model. He's not massively expensive, but relatively expensive model, through you being overzealous with where you place the model, basically. So that's the one thing you've got to be careful of with them, is that you don't think that they're invincible and you stick them too far up the board. But again, all of these different units that I'm taking in my initial 300 points, they're designed basically to hammer back my opponent and keep them in a position where they're not taking the game to me. I'm going to take lots of casualties, but that's part of it. With the way that I'm playing and the units that I've got, I'm going to take lots of casualties, but it's going to be very hard for my opponent to, number one, avoid the bombers, number two, avoid that horrible sniper, and number three, get through two ginormous units of troopers. And with the way that you score hits in Relics, rolling doubles, rolling hits isn't as common as other systems that I've played. So a lot of the time, when you consider, a model is relatively easy to kill, it is, but you've still got to roll a double to be able to do it, and that involves your opponent knowing what they're doing, moving properly, you knowing how to best move your models. So the whole thing is designed to really force my opponent back and ask questions of them, not their models necessarily, but them as a commander, in terms of how they strategically move themselves to, number one, negate the fact of me jamming two bombers down their throat really early game, but then how they're going to recover from that and position their models to negate the horde of troopers and other bits and pieces that are going to run across the board, basically. So I'm quite interested to see how it performs and see what the reaction is of my opponents when I come to play against them. So yeah, that's what I'm interested in seeing, really. I just want to say also that I don't play in a lot of events because I normally run them, so it makes quite a nice change for me to be able to to write a list that isn't just designed to have a bit of fun with one of my mates on a Saturday afternoon, but is designed to be a little more competitive and play that way. The group of guys that we play with are really great as well, so I know none of them are going to be offended by what I take, and the fact that I'm doing a video in advance and I've listed up what I'm taking, I think probably helps them quite a lot. So in fact, it's probably really stupid of me doing this video, but one of those, isn't it? You just crack on and see how it goes. Now, as I mentioned in the scenario pack, which is really important, and I'll link it up with the video, is that in game 2, what basically happens is you start the game with your standard 300 points, and then all of a sudden on the second turn, both you and your opponent have sent your messages off, and reinforcements come in from a rolled board edge. So whoever wins gets to choose which half of the board in their opponent's half they're going to come onto the board on, and then the opponent goes on the opposite side, basically. So you end up with these two flanking forces. So I needed to come up with something, and I was a little bit stuck really to start with what was going to go into my 100 points. With the way that the Britanans work, I decided I'd have to take a commander model of some description, someone who can keep my guys in shape and try and get them into position. And really, I had a lot of choices, and I could have picked loads of different things. Dragoons would have been all right. What else? Heavy cav might have worked, but they're expensive. I've only got 100 points. And then I thought, well, I don't often use my Highlanders. In fact, I very rarely use Highlanders. So I've got 3 of them painted up. I thought, great. Well, they're quite quick, regardless of what side they come on. Within a turn, they're probably going to be in range to start bringing a bit of pain on my opponents. So I thought, right, I'll give them a whirl. And I just think, theme-wise, having a load of, kilt-wearing nut job run across the board with broadswords would be quite funny, actually. So they've gone in. So I've got 3 of them. Now, Highlanders are one of those units, and I said I don't take them very often, and I don't, simply because they are quite pricey. The defense 1, they're relatively mobile, move of 6, but I've found whenever I tend to use them, and perhaps I'm not using them correctly, I don't know, perhaps that's something you can come back to me on. Even when I up the unit to sort of 4 or 5 models, I find that they just are so big a target, because when they go in, they absolutely maim things, that they don't really get a lot done for me. And for the points, I can take other things that I know will get a job done for me based on the way that I play. So it's one of those really. If any of you have got any ways of using those guys, I suppose the one advantage to this is that they're coming on from the side in the second game. So because I've got so many troopers and I'm going to be engaging quite a lot, I can hopefully tie up a lot of the stuff that would normally target those Highlanders and give them a chance to really shine, I suppose. So on top of that, I've took a company sergeant major simply because he's dirt cheap. You know, he'll buff stuff as well. You know, he's another model, but mainly it's just going to give me a model that can run in from the side with the Highlanders and cause a bit of damage. And then I thought, well, actually, I've took one Marksman. I probably could do with a second for the final game as well. So what I've decided to do is stick a Marksman in. Now, what's going to be really interesting is that if my bombs go off and I start dealing damage to my opponent's characters early game, they're going to have to be exceptionally careful where they place those models, because if a Marksman drops onto the board 5 inches in with an 18-inch range, that's 23 inches across the board, you know, chances are they're going to have to cover him on two fronts. Then they're going to have to cover him from a sniper shot from the rear and one from the front, plus all the other stuff that can blow them up in my force and get their hands on them. So actually it's probably quite scary. In fact, if I wanted to be a really dirty git, I'd probably take more of them coming in from the side, because you don't need a command model for them to operate. You know, they're independent of the rest of your force in effect. But I thought that might be a bit mean, and I quite like the idea of the Highlanders charging in from the side. So that makes up really that 100-point contingent that is going to come on and hopefully cause a bit of mayhem. I'm also really interested to see whether anyone doesn't take a model that can command the units coming on from the side, because it's a bit of a gamble, and I was toying with the idea of perhaps doing that, but I wussed out and decided I'd play safe and take fewer models and make sure they can operate properly. The other thing is, I suppose by that point in the game, if someone's found a way of sniping one or two of your characters, you've got someone with a relatively large command range to back up and come and act as a new model for the rest of the force. So yeah, it's one of those. So that's going to be that's going to be, I think, my favorite game, looking at the way that it's tying up. It looks like there's some interesting things that are going to happen. It's going to be a little bit random, but not so random that, you know, player skill will be removed from who wins the game. We like that kind of style of game. That's the way that we generally try and play our games. And then coming into the final game, where those two forces come together, it's relatively easy, because, you know, the Marksman's, you know, going to work almost on his own, separate from the rest of the force. The two company sergeant majors then in the 400-point list will basically be buffing the two big trooper units, making them harder and better than in the 300-point list. And then the rest of my army is going to function exactly as it was, except I'm going to have 3 Highlanders, which again are very fast. They can gain position, and again they're going to put threats on my opponent that they're going to have to deal with, in line with the rest of my army that's also going to be pushing up. So they kind of fit the theme of that kind of play aggressively, push up the board and ask questions of my opponent, really. The bombers are going to work as they did before. That's not going to make a fat lot of difference. So, you know, we're all good really for the 400-point list. It all slots together quite nicely and is going to hopefully move the force forwards even further, cause more pressure on my opponent and ask more questions of them. So yeah, that's going to be my overall list. My overall play style, as you can probably tell, is going to be a little bit random compared to how you see Britanans played on a lot of videos. And hopefully I've given you an idea about Relics and the way that it can be played, that kind of breaks the norm especially with Britanans of sitting there as a gun line and then supporting that line as they move up the board with other units, other choices, as they charge in and counter charge as they get charged themselves. So I'm going to kind of break that mold a little bit and try and take a list that is very aggressive en masse, basically. Maybe not in their stats, but in the overall model count and the way that they maneuver in the game. So hopefully it'll be an interesting way to see them play. I'm looking forward to seeing my opponent's reactions to them. Like I said, I've not seen a list like it in any of the events that I've run so far. and yeah, just looking forward to actually playing in an event for for Relics. I've not actually had the chance yet, so it's going to be an interesting one. Um, if you've got any questions, or you want me to talk about any other units, or you've got perhaps suggestions for my list that you think would work better, or be more efficient, or be cooler, I don't mind. You pick any one of those, and I'm happy to have a chat about it. It might be one of those where over the next couple of weeks, where I play a few games, I might change the list slightly. Although I've got a feeling I'm going to stick with it, just because, um, as the person who wrote the pack, I don't want people to think that I'm being a bloody sod and changing my list at the last minute, basically. So happy to hear your thoughts on units. I'm happy to do a general Tactica thread, really, but I think that they are a bit wishy-washy, and I don't really see how me explaining what each model does is really going to benefit anyone, apart from someone who can't be bothered to read the Britannan rules, really. So yeah, I'm gonna be open for questions. I'd like to do a little battle run through of my 3 games from the event day on the 11th. If that is of interest for anyone, I'm more than happy to take some photos on the day, and give a bit of a talk back on how the games went. Might end up with pie on my face and get stuffed 3 times. That'd be quite funny. Um, but yeah, it's one of those. I'm really looking forward to it. If you've got any questions, then feel free to either post them up, send me a message, or whatever you guys do. I'm not a big videoer on YouTube. I don't have a big following, so if you do have any questions, just give us a shout, or give us a message on Facebook, and I'll try and answer it if I can. I hope you've enjoyed my little rant. It's gone on for what, 37 minutes nearly, bloody hell. And yeah, feel free to come back to me and ask any questions. I'll catch you soon.